If instead of buying that one extra yearling this year, you decided to take the same money and put it into a single sports medicine application, thermography, heart rate monitoring, blood testing, whatever, what do you think you'd be expecting out of that application? What is the purpose of sports medicine? What is the purpose of trying to use these various sciences that come under the umbrella of the sports medicine application? I think that preserve and enhance probably describes the entire gamut of sports medicine applications. Preserve the raw material, enhance final performance. And that goes for whether you're dealing with racehorses or any kind of a performance horse. Basically, what you want to do is keep them alive and get the maximal performance out of the athlete that you can. It goes for human athletes, it goes for equine athletes, it goes for dogs. Any athlete needs to stay alive and perform at maximum ability if the animal is to be a viable candidate for even being called an athlete. Now, when we say preserve and enhance, there probably are more things. For example, under preserve comes preventive medicine, injury prevention, lameness intervention. When you see it starting to come on, how do you know that it's coming on? How do you stop in time? Find the cause, diagnose the problem, solve it, and then go on. And then finally, still in the preserving category, you're looking at rehabilitating animals that have been injured, that have not survived the conditioning process, or the variables that exist, racetrack surface, bad riders, bad shoeing, the 10,000 things can go wrong. Something goes wrong, you get an injured athlete, what do you do? How do you bring the animal back? And then enhancing ability, conditioning, diet, nutrition, proper training in terms of skills and mental development. But there's even more. When you think of culling expensive athletic candidates, in other words, in the thoroughbred business, they're talking about $100 a day training fees. Now it's $3,000 a month plus the vet bill. That's $4,000 a month. Transportation, shoeing, all of the expenses that go along with owning a racehorse. If you've got a non-athlete in the barn, you don't want that non-athlete to be there very long. You want to get rid of them. You want to get them out of the barn into somebody else's hands, or out into the 3-day eventing area, or if he's not a racehorse, you certainly don't want to be training. So you want to be able to make your training stable economically viable, and that means getting rid of the non-athletes. Also, you want to be able to determine what is the actual racing potential of an individual animal as soon as possible. You want to see it early on. You want to know that this horse not only has the ability to take on conditioning, has acquisition, but is likely to be a horse that will be able to run long and win classic races, as opposed to a horse that doesn't have those possibilities, that probably is going to have to go short and fast and risk the dangers involved in high speed, ultra high speed racing. You want to find these things out. So when we talk about the sports medicine applications, we've got a whole set of tasks that we can look at, and we look at the tools that will deliver those tasks for us, and we find out that one of the key tools, the most useful tool of all, is the cheapest, and that is heart rate monitoring. What is heart rate? What does heart rate tell you? Heart rate is basically the tachometer of the horse. How hard does this horse have to work? How hard does his chemistry have to put out to deliver a given piece of work? 3-minute rate of speed for a half mile. What does that cost a horse? And how do you know what it costs a horse? Well, we know that heart rate and speed, or heart rate and effort, basically, run in parallel lines. As the effort goes up, the heart rate goes up. If there are some difficulties, some lack of efficiencies, then the heart rate is going to go up with that level of stress caused by the work level and the lack of efficiencies in stride, gait, shoes, resistance, hills, deep tracks. All of these things are reflected, and lameness reflected in the level of heart rate against a given piece of exercise. And that means that you have to have a place where you can find out exactly how much work is being delivered, how fast this 1,000 pounds moves from point A to point B, the velocity of the animal. And velocity versus heart rate is what you call a V140 or V200. The velocity that produces a 140 heart rate, the velocity that produces a 200 heart rate on a given day under certain circumstances or given conditions, standard time and temperature. What are you expecting from a horse? What is the curve that you would expect to see that horse go through as it becomes fit for racing? The V140 might be 10 meters per second when the horse first starts out, and it might end up being 12 meters per second. It might start out at 6 meters per second and end up being 10 meters per second on a given individual going through a long-term scientifically designed conditioning program. You can expect to see significant improvement in V140. One of the things we know about V140s and V200s, that's velocity at 200 heart rate, is that horses that score high, in other words, horses that have a higher velocity at a given heart rate, are the more natural athletes, more capable athletes, and will remain so throughout the condition. If you have 10 horses and one has a V200 of 15 meters per second and another has a V200 of 12 meters per second, the 15 meters per second horse is a better horse and will be on the very last day of training just as he is on the very first day of training. So you have 10 horses and you have 3 down here, 3 in the middle, and 3 at the top, and you want to save money. The 3 at the bottom have to go. They have to go to somebody else. So immediately, within the first 30 days of training, you can establish V140s and V200s and cull the bottom third of the group just on that basis alone. On the other hand, there is another way of looking at horses over a period of time, and that is the rate of acquisition. Some horses, given a piece of exercise today, will improve by that exercise, and next Thursday will come back greatly improved and show that to you in terms of heart rate response to a given load of work. Other animals, you hit with a piece of work today and you see no improvement at all in a week. And month after month, gradual, very slow improvement you'll get. Natural athletes have high rates of acquisition, and if you look at their bloods, you'll see high enzyme activity, oxidative enzyme activity, anaerobic enzyme activities, muscle enzyme activities. You'll see those triggered to respond to exercise much more dramatically than in horses that don't have a rate of acquisition. You can measure these things month by month, week by week, and just again begin to predict what type of an athlete you're going to get out of the other end of the training process. Heart rate is a tool that measures all those things without having to go invasive, without having to draw blood, without having to measure the size of the heart of the horse, without having to do a muscle biopsy, without having to really stress the animal to the nth degree to find out what his maximal potential. One of the biggest problems with racehorses today is this peaking syndrome, where somewhere along the line the temptation becomes just overwhelming for the trainer or the rider on his own to see what the horse has got. How much stuff does this animal have? Can this horse really blast down that straightaway? Can it beat the Gage horse over here? Can it beat Charlie Whittingham's horse around the last turn? Let's bet $5 from this corner to that corner. If you can avoid that kind of a test, that gigantic surprise to the horse's system, by instead getting an accurate estimate of the horse's ability through sports medicine tests, then you'll save your athlete, and you'll also know precisely where you are in the conditioning process. As you're going through a conditioning process, you'll be able to know precisely how far along this standard conditioning curve your animal is, and how it compares to all the rest of the horses there. And then once we have a good, strong database where people who are watching this videotape right now across the country, hundreds are watching it, and thousands have read the books and are practicing sports medicine techniques, especially heart rate monitoring. What we're trying to do is gather together a large database of information so that on my computer and on your computer, or in the paperwork that we deliver you every month, that you'll see where your horse fits among 10,000 horses. And in human athletics, this is done. I mean, this is part of the regime. This is why human athletes are so competitive. Why small countries like Romania and East Germany can produce fabulous athletes. One of the reasons is that they study this. The whole government is involved in promoting their country by investing huge sums in testing modalities and in conditioning processes so that their small population can deliver spectacular athletes, where our huge population, with almost no support from the government, well, no support from the government, has to do it by hit and miss. And there are in this country some great institutions. Ball State University in Colorado Springs, they have a sports medicine complex there for human athletes, and those are great, but they still don't support our athletes like communist countries do, because the government has a free hand in those countries. And the athletes are national heroes, just as are their scientists and their bomb builders and astronauts, soldiers. They're all government sponsored. Well, it would be nice that in horse racing, not that we had government sponsorship, but if we had applied research, cooperative applied research across the country, that everybody could tap into a central database and know what a given heart rate at a given speed means in this long-term conditioning program that we're trying to design to A, preserve our athletes, and B, enhance performance, so that we don't see any more articles like have been appearing, why aren't thoroughbreds any faster? Why aren't thoroughbreds any faster? Well, they're not being trained. That's one real good reason why they're not any faster. And when you listen to some scientists talk about, well, gee, it's a biomechanical machine that has reached its mechanical limits, and if the horse goes any faster at all, it's going to explode. Well, they said the same thing about Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. The human heart will explode trying to exceed this spectacular barrier, this mental barrier that existed for human athletes for years, until Roger Bannister demolished it. Now it is no more, and the human mile is down in the 348s or even lower. You know, these barriers that we artificially set up, this biomechanical barrier for the thoroughbred, on the one side it's irrelevant, because thoroughbreds don't have to go any faster to break Secretariat's record at the Belmont by 12 seconds. I mean, he did essentially 624s. Well, $5,000 claimers are out there knocking off the occasional 21 and 22 second quarter. And if you glued together 622s or 623s, why, you'd beat Secretariat by as many lengths as he beat all the other horses in that Belmont. So you don't need any more speed, but you can get more speed. That's why Carl Lewis and all of our sprinters spend time training 4 to 6 hours every day for 8 years in a row. They don't do it for nothing. They're getting an improvement. Even their natural ability, in their minds, is not enough to overcome the Russians and the East Germans. They have to practice, and they have to practice hard, and they have to do tons and tons of hard exercise to be good. And they're our natural athletes. They're our very best athletes, the cream of the crop. But the typical high school sprinter also does 2 to 4 hours, depending on how serious he is and how serious his coach is, 2 to 4 hours of work every day. Sprinters, every day. Why? Because it enhances their ability. An 11-second 100-yard dash becomes a 10.5-second 100-yard dash, and then 10.2, and then 10.1, and then 9.9. Little by little, year by year, step by step. Meanwhile, we've got, in our game, we have trainers who say that 120 days is plenty and a horse can't do more than a mile a day or 2 miles a day. They're dead wrong. They're dead wrong. And how much can a horse do? How far can you go? Well, we don't even have the foggiest idea how far you can go. But as we go, we want to know what we're doing. We want to monitor our progress along this conditioning curve. We want to see precisely how much it takes to deliver, let's say, a 222 Belmont. What does it take? Well, right now, a 224 would be a miracle. A 2-minute Kentucky Derby is a miracle these days. What does it take? What kind of a machine does it take to deliver a 2-minute Derby or a 1:58 Derby? And the best way, the easiest way, the least costly way to monitor the progress of an animal is by measuring his heart rate response to a given exercise load. His heart rate response and recovery to that exercise load. Why is recovery important? Heart rate response tells you how strenuous the exercise is, but heart rate recovery tells you how deep you dug into the animal's resources, his reserves. How much lactate did you produce that did not become oxidized and just sat there in those muscle cells and began to paralyze those muscles? That's a measure of how quickly the heart rate recovers. As long as the lactate's there in volume, the heart rate has to stay up so that lactate can be pumped out of the muscle cells, pumped back through the liver, converted to glycogen, and repacked into the muscle cells. So recovery is a key factor in knowing how much anaerobic work or how much lactate producing work the horse can tolerate, and how much lactate is being produced and not used, not burned as fuel in a given piece of exercise. Now, peak heart rates are another thing. When you're doing a standardized exercise test, and that means standardized means the same speed for every horse. In other words, a 3-minute mile, a 2-minute mile, a 2:30 mile, a 2:30 quarter, 2:30 rate quarter. Standardized. In other words, every horse that gets measured on this test does the same speed on the same conditions with the same rider or the same rider weight, and you clock the speed and the heart rate response to that speed. That's a standardized exercise test, and when you get everybody doing exactly the same thing, then you'll be able to compare from horse to horse which horse has to work harder and is less efficient than the other horse. And that's the purpose of a standardized exercise test. The typical standardized exercise test for the beginning thoroughbred is a 3-minute mile rate clocked somewhere in the middle. Once the horse's heart rate gets up and settles down and says, okay, this is where I'm at and this is what my average is going to be, then you clock his speed for 1/8 of a mile. For a standardbred, that same thing might be a 3:30 mile. Arabians, it might be still between 3 minutes and 3:30. But a standardized exercise test all the way through. In other words, what you'll see is today's 3-minute mile will produce 180 heart rate. Next week's will produce 175. 2 months later, you're down to 165. That's your standardized exercise test. It's always the same speed, and while your horse in practice will be going a lot faster than 3 minutes eventually, you still go back to that test of cardiovascular efficiency for your heart rate test. You can do V200s, which means instead of looking at the time that you're delivering, you look at a standardized heart rate number. Let's get out and deliver a 200 heart rate and find out how fast the horse is going, as opposed to going out at a certain speed and find out what kind of heart rate it produces. You can go either way. They're both standardized exercise tests. But the 200 heart rate is different than the 140 heart rate in that you're measuring anaerobic ability. You're measuring what they would call the lactate threshold, or the steady state, the cruise speed of the horse. Once the horse's heart rate and speed don't run parallel, once the heart rate falls away from the increase in speed, then your lactate curve goes up like mad. You want to find out where that place is. And typically you're talking about something in the neighborhood of a 200 heart rate when you're approaching that lactate threshold, or anaerobic threshold, what they call an anaerobic threshold. So you can find that out with an athlete, and that's different than measuring cardiovascular efficiency that you're measuring down in the 140, 160 area heart rates. Now, there's some mistaken ideas about heart rate. One of the mistaken ideas is that you don't want to be exceeding a 200 heart rate. I may have helped cause this when I wrote the Fit Racehorse back in 1982, because I talked about the 200 heart rate as being that lactate threshold, where in the unfit horse, when you go across that line, you've only got a few seconds worth of maximal effort before that lactate is out the roof and your horse's legs become paralyzed and the fetlock starts to droop to the ground and injuries become highly probable. But the horse is going to experience, in a race, is going to experience heart rates that can go in excess of 240. And if you don't expose them to those levels somewhere in training, then you will not have a horse prepared to race. You'll have a horse prepared to deliver cruising speed or steady state for miles, but you won't have a horse ready to go 1 mile at max, at racing speed, at full competitive performance. So you do have to train at rates of speed that cost high heart rates. Another misconception is that a horse maxing out, let's say, and there's no reason ever to breeze 3/8 with a thoroughbred, but if you do, and you do hit a 240 heart rate, to presume then that that animal is not as fit as one who, let's say, at a maximal breeze never crosses 200. In fact, the opposite is true. The one that has the lesser VO2 max, the lesser cardiovascular capacity, the lesser ability to maintain and benefit from high heart rates, that's the animal that's not any good, and probably the animal that's sick or has something definitely wrong with its heart or this kind of thing. Your good athlete will be able to rev that engine to maximal heart rate, to a maximal VO2, but then recover from that max heart rate very, very rapidly. In other words, you'll blast him for whatever distance you're going to do. He hits 240, but within a minute his heart rate is back down to 115. And when you're looking at recovery heart rates, one of the things, and heart rates in general, one of the things you want to know is that there is emotional content in heart rates at the beginning of a workout, when the horse is settling into work and is not really working yet and has not really built a challenge to his cardiovascular system. His heart rate will be all over the place depending on whether he sees a dog coming across the track or sees a bird or sees a shadow. His heart rate will jump up and down 30-40 points due to emotion until he settles in. And at the same time, if you wait longer than a minute, in other words, you cross the finish line, You start your stopwatch. You count that stopwatch down to a minute. Your horse is slowing down, stopped in front of you, and at 1 minute you get the heart rate of that horse. A 1 minute recovery. You're going to have a very accurate idea of the actual stress and chemical strain of that exercise than if you waited 5 minutes and walked the horses around in circles or did whatever, because the horse's heart rate will recover very rapidly and then flatten out and then start to become emotionally affected again, so that it'll drop to 115 and it'll spin back up to 128 just on the mental attitude of the horse. A horse going onto a racetrack will typically generate a 128 to 160 heart rate until it settles into work, and then you get an honest heart rate of, let's say, 140 once the horse is settled in. And when the horse is recovering, typically for the period that it's recovering, for about 2 minutes until it pays back the phosphagen fuel of the system and gets agitated and wants to move on again, you'll have a very real reflection of the cost of that exercise. Beyond 2 minutes, it starts to go haywire. You don't get an accurate reflection. And I like 1 minute heart rates only because I've been in the habit of 1 minute heart rates for 14 years. So I've got a real good feel for what a 1 minute heart rate recovery means in terms of, are we going to kill this horse, or is this horse performing well? Are we doing enough work with this horse? Those kinds of things. I've got a real good feel for that with 1 minute recovery heart rates. Now, there was out of Australia came a lot of science concerning heart score, which was a score given to an animal looking at, when they took an ECG on a horse, they looked at the QRS peak and duration of that heartbeat and determined essentially the size of the heart muscle. And they found that there was a strong, very strong correlation with a big heart. Well, today you can still do that. It's a very useful technique, but even more effective and more useful is your veterinarian with his ultrasound scanning device. You can actually look into the chest. It's a soft tissue x-ray. You can look into the chest and actually measure the thickness of the walls of the heart, measure the size of the heart precisely with an ultrasound scanning device. And most veterinarians or most clinics have ultrasound scanning devices for looking at tendons, for looking at heart and lungs, for lesions in the lungs and this type of thing. And it's an extremely valuable tool that should be a part of any kind of a sports medicine operation. It's an expensive tool, and it's a clinical tool in that it's a difficult machine to read, to see what you're looking at, and you've got to know your cross-sectional anatomy very well to understand what you're looking at. And it's best used in the hands of an experienced veterinarian. It's not like thermography, where thermography anybody can see what is going on in a horse's legs, but ultrasound scanning is much more difficult and should be in the hands of the veterinarian. The veterinarian's place, the veterinarian belongs in this sports medicine environment. You need a medical person there for blood tests and interpretations, lameness examinations, if you can find the right veterinarian. The veterinarian, there's two kinds of, well, there's 100 kinds of veterinarians, but there's two basic kinds of veterinarians. One is the hopper and blocker, the needle man, and there's tens of, I don't know how many thousands of them are out there, but they're out there. And they're not as inclined to think in terms of preventive medicine and to think in terms of complete diagnosis of an injury or a problem. They'd rather sell a pill and not spend more than 10 minutes at the side of a horse. They'd rather inject than diagnose. But there's the other kind of a veterinarian, and typically he's not your racetrack vet, but he's out in the country practicing in his own clinic, who is very interested in sports medicine, very interested in the applications that he can deliver, and is extremely cooperative in setting up testing procedures, getting good, accurate blood tests for you, doing the ultrasound scanning for you, helping in the rehabilitation process, helping in the diagnostic process. You know, if you're scan with the infrared shows something coming on, well, that's not diagnostic. It just says, hey, there's something going on in that knee, and the job then is to diagnose. And the vet with his x-rays and his ultrasound scanner and various other modalities, blocking modalities, whatever, can help determine precisely what the cause is and then help cure it. Medical people are the key to sports medicine. Now, there's another relatively cheap tool that can be used in a sports medicine center that will predict a horse's recovery, his stress recovery, rebound process for you, show you pretty much where you are from day to day on the animal, whether or not the horse is race ready, whether or not the horse is balanced muscularly, whether or not the rider is balanced, and that's the scale. A single platform scale is good for just knowing if your horse is completely fueled for today's race. A horse will typically lose anywhere from 25 to 45 pounds of weight in 2 minutes worth of racing, and that weight has to be paid back before the horse can be considered to be refueled completely to the level that he was prior to the race. And you're going to find out that your horse races best at a given weight. Within 5 pounds one way or the other, he's going to race, and this has been demonstrated hundreds of times in Europe. They all use scales over here. We don't use any scales in America. It's real unfortunate. Again, it's another real cheap tool that nobody is aware of, nobody attempts to use, just because of ignorance, just because of lack of knowledge of how to use these things. And scales are kind of tricky to use. A single platform scale, you'll find that if you feed the horse first and then weigh him, you're going to have 15 pounds difference or more by the time he drinks his water with his feed. You've got to weigh them either before or after feed, probably best before in the morning, at the same time every day, under the same circumstances with every horse if you possibly can, so that you get an accurate day-to-day weight. And then race day morning, you catch that weight that day, and generally an increased weight is going to be beneficial, especially to a horse going long. It's going to be beneficial to a certain point, and then you're going to find that above that weight he's carrying too much weight for the efficiency of his stride. But compared to today's skinny, greyhoundy $10,000 claimers, if you look at our classic runners, the horses that can carry themselves for a mile and a quarter, a mile and a half, you're going to see massive muscle, especially behind, big slabby or big round muscle behind. And you think of the horse's weight, you keep increasing his weight, his readiness weight, until finally you see a fall off of performance. In other words, today he races a mile in 1:38, he adds 25 pounds and he races in 1:37 and 2. He adds another 25 pounds and he races in 1:36 and 3. Adds another 25 pounds and he races in 1:37 and 3. Then you pull that 25 pounds back off and he races in 1:36 and 3, and you put it back on and he races in 1:37 and 3. Pretty soon you're honed into this horse's racing weight, and science says that what his racing weight is at 2, it'll be at 3, and it'll be at 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 9 and 13. He's going to carry the same racing weight and the same efficiency throughout his lifetime. Find it out once and then you know where this horse is. So it's worth fooling around for a few months trying to figure out where that racing weight is, and then it's well worth the effort to keep the horse at that racing weight. The other thing, on a day-to-day basis, you can find out what is the recovery cycle of your. Does he do a hard workout on Monday and is ready for more work on Tuesday in terms of muscle fuel replenishment, or does it take him till Thursday or Friday to replenish his fuels and be ready to go? That really counts when you're trying to set up a horse for a top race, the Kentucky Derby. Do you breeze him on Wednesday or Monday or Tuesday, or not for 10 days before the event? How do you do it? And do you race him at a mile and then try to race him at a mile and a quarter, or do you race him at 6 furlongs and try to race him at a mile and a quarter, or do you race him at a mile and a half and then try to race him at a mile and a quarter? You don't know until you figure out that individual animal. Each animal is going to be different, and each one has a recovery cycle, a fueling replenishment cycle that it's going to be different. And you have to figure out, or you should figure it out. Now, think of a scale that's divided in two, so you measure the back and the front. What does that tell you? One of the things it can tell you, everybody says 60% of the weight of the horse is taken up by the front legs. Probably not so. Probably what you find in a racing horse is that balance shifts rearward. The rear drops, the front end lifts, and you've probably got more weight than 40% on the rear legs at any given point in time. The front legs are basically there to get out of the way, and the quicker they get out of the way, the better. And so the horse will tend to, with good conditioning, tend to lighten up on the front and load the back. He'll be coming under and reaching under and throwing more weight to the back. Acceleration itself, a good powerful acceleration with those back legs, throws the weight rearward. And so when it comes down the front legs through acceleration, the horse is less likely to be carrying that 60% weight that he may be when he's standing still on those front legs in a racing stride. But he may be, okay, and you can find that out, and you can look at horses that are going ka-chunk, ka-chunk, and landing hard on their front legs. You can help determine why they're doing that and how you can change. One of the things I can tell you for sure is that through a good comprehensive conditioning program that's supported by adequate carbohydrate and protein nutrition, you're going to see, as the horse gets fitter and fitter, you're going to see a significant shift of weight toward the rear. You're going to see those insides of those thighs and the rear end blow up like balloons, and you're going to see the belly start to loosen, the muscle around the chest start to shrink down. You're going to see some power come up from the forearms and the gaskins, but basically the weight, the center of gravity of the horse is going to move toward the rear as the horse gets fitter and fitter, because those rear muscles are the propulsive muscles. They're the high-speed muscles. They're the things that drive the horse forward fast. So you're going to see a shift toward the rear. And you want to see it. And when you do see it, what you want to do is find the center of balance of that horse. If 600 pounds are carried on the front and 400 pounds are carried behind, then the center of balance is going to be somewhere at the 6:4 or 6:4 ratio on the horse, right up here on the shoulder. If it's 50-50, it's 500 pounds here and 500 pounds there. It's going to be further back, and you want that girth to come down on the center of balance, and you want those stirrups to be right at the center of balance, so that the rider's weight has no inertial effect on the horse's gait. If the horse has to keep overcoming dead weight flopping back and forth on his back, then that's very costly. If you think 2 pounds of a rider's weight is costly in a race, or 4 pounds, a misplaced center of balance on the rider is far more costly than those extra 2 pounds the horse has to carry. That's why balanced riders like Bill Shoemaker and Del Husse and some of these guys are extremely important, and why even in the exercise arena, the balance of the rider is the key to avoiding muscle soreness and bad knees and fat ankles. Riders can destroy a horse going slow. Try to do 3 miles with a bad rider, and you're going to have sore-legged horses, top to bottom, the whole stable, just because of a lack of balance of the rider. And with a scale that measures front to back, you can say, look, I want your feet here, I want your butt here, I want your head here, and I don't want them to move, because that's the center of balance of this horse. Now when you get on this horse over here, it's a whole different ball game. And here's how it is with this horse over here. And if you can teach a rider that as he's working, now again, how sharp is the rider and how adaptable is the rider, that's a problem that you're going to have to solve. And I can't solve it for you. You're going to have to find a way to find intelligent riders and capable riders and talented riders. They're almost impossible to find, but they can be found. They're out there. Now let's take to scale the final step. Instead of 2 platforms, front and back, let's say we have 4 platforms, 1 for each leg, so we can look at each individual leg's weight, we can look at the front to back, and we can look at the whole horse. So we can get racing weight, we can get balance of the center of balance of the horse, and we can also say that, gee, Mr. Trainer, this horse has been doing great all week long, but all of a sudden he's not standing on that right rear. And the thermography's not seeing anything. Could be up in his hip, could be osteochondrosis, could be muscle soreness, some of the things that thermography doesn't want to see, high up in the hips and shoulders. But whatever, suddenly today, this horse doesn't want to stand. At least he was 250 on each leg, now he's 225 on that leg and 275 on the left rear. How come? It's time to find out. Again, an early warning system for lameness, and you can go further than that with the pressure plates that Dr. Pratt developed for New Bolton Center. Is you can measure the shiver factor of a horse's muscles. If you've got an injured tendon or an injured muscle or any kind of an injury that's causing nerve endings to throw pain up to the horse's nervous system, the horse's body will be triggered to turn on and turn off those muscles that are controlling it. It doesn't know what to do. There's an injury, and the horse doesn't know whether he wants to stand on that leg or not. It's not in his mind that he doesn't know whether he wants to stand on that leg or not, but in his spinal cord, the spinal cord is receiving contradictory information. It's saying, hey, stand on it. No, don't stand on it. It hurts. Doesn't know what to do. So it shivers, and it shivers microscopically. You can't see it, but you can see it on an oscilloscope with a pressure plate that goes up and down as the horse is standing on it. You can see an oscilloscope showing that little minute shiver, and the degree of lameness, and this has been proven scientifically, can be measured through that kind of a plate. Now those scales, those type of things don't exist right now, but I'm agitating for them, and many of the things that I agitate for, because I promote, do come about. There are 4 position scales available now, and there are 2 position scales available. And single position scales, there's half a dozen of them available now, where in this country, where 3 or 4 years ago, the only thing you could get was one of those big clunky cow scales that you step a horse on and it rattles so bad and shakes so bad that the horse wants to jump out of it before you get a chance to take the weight. Now we've got electronic pressure sensitive scales that sit flat on the ground, don't wiggle, don't make any noise, and have an electronic readout that is accurate to 2 pounds on a 1,000-pound horse. Okay, now let's talk briefly about a pretty serious investment in diagnostic or early warning equipment, and that's the infrared thermography. Infrared thermography is a perfect early warning device, and it's a perfect combination with ultrasound imaging and x-rays and other diagnostics for a veterinary clinic. Infrared thermography, I can tell you that if you've got a stable of 10 thoroughbreds or 20 standardbreds, infrared thermography will pay for itself within the first 6 months that you're using it. And why? Right off the bat I can say that young horses, 2-year-olds going into training, more often than not are going to experience at some time epiphyseal swelling and inflammation, knees, ankles, and if you don't catch these problems early, then what happens is the synovial membrane gets out of whack, stops passing the proper chemicals in the right proportions, and the synovial fluid goes awry, becomes thin, becomes less of a lubricant, and then cartilage begins to wear, and the possibilities of chips and these types of things coming on are much more significant, especially if the horse then tries to get off that leg because it's a little bit sore and starts putting heavier pressure on the other leg. Then you begin to run into serious trouble. Hocks, knees, ankles, These are things that the infrared thermography sees instantly today. The infrared thermography can see needle holes, 3 or 4 or 5 days old. You can see where a horse has been injected with a needle. The needle hole stands out like a cigarette out in the middle of a grass field stands out to a thermography machine. Infrared thermography sees heat. It sees infrared. So it sees all the inflammatory processes that are going on close to the surface of the skin. And that means that it can look from the feet all the way up through the knees and the hocks. It can also look at nerve damage and other circulatory problems. Some problems that have to do with nerves have to do with cold areas rather than hot areas. If you damage a horse's back in a certain place, there's going to be a whole part of his body that's not getting proper nervous stimulation and is not getting circulation. And if that goes on, then you'll probably see muscular atrophy in that area at one time or another later on. These are things you want to see early on. You want to catch them early on, correct the problem, and then intervene in that lameness, and then go on with your athlete once he's well enough to go on. And infrared thermography is the perfect device to see these things a month before any clinical signs, any signs of lameness that the trainer can see. Trainers have told me that they can feel the same heat that the thermography is seeing, and that's just not true. The thermography is sensitive to 1/10 of a degree centigrade, and 1.5 degrees centigrade is indications of inflammation and damage going on in the horse. And believe me, there is not a trainer in the country that can feel a 1.5 degree centigrade difference from spot to spot on the horse. They can't do it. On the other hand, and I've had this experience 3 times now, a trainer who is a conventional trainer and used to going on until the horse falls down dead or comes up crippled or whatever, infrared thermography can irritate a trainer like this, because this kind of a mentality doesn't want to know about all the mistakes that are being made. He doesn't want to know that breezes of 3/8 and 33 are crippling everything he touches, and that those cripplings are being predicted a month in advance. That first breeze, you can see the next morning, you can see all the damage that was done. I mean, so vividly it stands out like stars and moons in the sky. Trainers with the mentality of keep your eyes closed until we crash don't like infrared thermography. Infrared thermography doesn't lie. It tells the truth. And unfortunately, a lot of the truth is that the conditioning process, the surprises that the horse's body is being put through with arbitrary breezes at arbitrary speeds, depending on what the rider wants to do today, or depending on what the trainer wants to take a peek at today. These kinds of workouts kill horses, and they kill them quickly. And 2 or 3 breezes like this in a row, and you've got a dead animal, or you've got an animal that will never be an athlete again. And so those are common mistakes. And if you've got a common trainer with common habits, then what you're going to find is that he won't enjoy the eye of thermography on it. There are several different kinds of infrared thermography. I've used both the AGA, that's made in Sweden, I believe, and the Hughes ProBuy. And I like the Hughes better than the AGA. One of the reasons is because now the Hughes is down to $25,000, where the AGA is still up around $60,000 to $80,000. And if you get the complete computerized configuration of the Hughes, you're at about $37,000. But then the whole thing is leasable, so that you're paying $500 to $1,000 a month, depending on what configuration you get. I think the Hughes is better, but there are probably other thermography machines out there that are going to eventually be less expensive and more valuable because of that. We'll just watch and see. The more they get used, the more information is available. I've got a stack of diskettes right here with about, each one of these holds about 70 pictures on it. So I've got 800 pictures of different types of lameness on there. And You can get Polaroid pictures of a horse's legs. If you want to take a picture to your vet, you can take a picture and show them, hey, this is what we saw on this horse. What is it? What does it look like to you? This one looks like it's got a bad ankle. Does it have a bad ankle? Let's take an ultrasound and take a look at it and see where that lesion is and what that lesion is. Or let's take a synovial fluid sample and find out. Let's x-ray and find out. Let's test for tissue damage with blood enzyme, this type of thing. So the infrared thermography is the very best early warning system that is possible. Another application for predicting and enhancing performance, and sometimes for early warning, is a process they call gait analysis. And gait analysis can be anything from looking at a distance from the horse and watching those legs fall and measuring the time that the horse's foot is on the ground, the time that it's in the air, and the time that it's going through its stride, and the relationship between the four legs and how efficient that relationship is, whether it's going like this or it's going like this, and how much overlap time there are between the two legs being on the ground at the same time. That's one way of gait analysis. Another way is looking at the flight of the foot of a given animal, shoeing and balancing. Thoroughbred people don't know a lot about shoeing and balancing, but it's extremely important that the shoe and the foot be properly balanced so that the flight through the air is accurate. A foot going through the air like this and coming down can come down any way it just happens to hit. A good flight of a foot, a balanced foot, will fly straight and land perfectly every time with practice at the speed that the horse is going to have to go. So you want to be able to see that. How do you see that? On standardbred, you can hook the camera to your video camera to the bottom of the seat of the jog bike and watch it. On thoroughbreds, it's more difficult. You have to either drive a truck alongside the horse, or you have to put it on a high-speed treadmill to see how those feet move. High-speed treadmills are an ideal sports medicine center tool, because with those you can Tufts University has a videotape out now of everything they're doing on their high-speed treadmills, and they do gait analysis. They do have the horse going at 35 miles an hour on the treadmill with a video scope down its lungs, and you can watch the actual lungs doing their work as the horse is galloping at full speed on the treadmill. Take blood test, on-board blood tests as the horse goes through a very stepped exercise test and this type of thing. So, high-speed treadmills are great, but gait analysis is one way to determine how efficient the animal's stride is, and if there is anything you can do to correct the inefficiencies in that stride through shoeing, through exercise. One of the things we know is that uphill galloping and acceleration work in both standardbreds and thoroughbreds, where the horse accelerates and then slows down, accelerates and slows down, accelerates and slows down. What we know about that exercise is it does change the stride of the animal, and it changes it into a longer, more efficient stride in such a way that the horse's rear end tucks under, reaches further up underneath that girth, and throws the horse further with each and every stride, so that there's a more powerful thrust, a lot less weight put on the front legs, a lot more flight time as opposed to stance time on the ground. These things can be measured with just simple video gait analysis, where you have a video that has decent slow motion without any irritation in it. One of the things you better know with your running horses is whether or not they use the rotary gallop. I've talked about this in other tapes, but just again, a diagonal gallop goes left rear, left front, right front. A rotary gallop goes left rear, right front, left front in a circle. Okay, and if it's going that way, then the left rear and the left front, if it's going left rear, right front, left front, those two want to come together. When they're both, the front leg is through with its stance phase and the back leg is through almost with its recovery phase, they come together and they'll interfere. And that means that if your horse is coming out of the gate full blast and is in the rotary gallop, which many horses are, you're going to get interference, a stumble, a pulled shoe, a horse that wants to run sideways to avoid cracking his shins behind. Lots of problems can come from that, and you have to try to shoo the horse out of the problem. And the way to shoo the horse out of the problem is to raise the front angles and possibly roll the toes so that front foot gets out of there quicker than the back foot has a chance to come up and grab a hold of it. So that's one thing that video gait analysis can tell you, is how your horse starts from a gait. There is a test called bone density analysis. Bone density analysis shoots ultrasound through the cannon bone of the horse and measures the time at which that sound travels from one side of the bone to the other in nanoseconds. And the faster the sound travels, the denser the bone. And science has shown us that it's a very accurate test of how strong the bone is. And we know from the science that when we see about a 20% loss of bone density as measured by these ultrasound density meters, we're on the very ragged edge of having a fracture in that cannon bone. And it's also probably a reflection of the bone throughout the legs of the horse, that all the bone is starting to become, for one reason or another, fatigued to the point of breaking, just like the tops flying off these airplanes, or airplane wings finally falling off because there's just too much fatigue. The horse does have the ability to repair that kind of fatigue, but if stresses come too hard, too big a surprise to the horse's leg, and they come too often so that there's not a time or a chance for that bone to recover, then gradually the density gets lower and lower and lower until it reaches that threshold where just the slightest misstep is going to snap the bone. Again, it's a predictive thing that can save you $30,000 to $30 million depending on the horse you're working with. Too bad Ruffian didn't have it available for her. Now, the athlete's blood is a river of information. There are thousands of things that blood will tell you about the health of your animal, about its level of fitness, and about the stress reactions it's having to a given exercise load. The first thing that you would look now, cell counts, and these are standard CBCs that are done on horses. You know, if you've got an infection going, they're useful. If you've got true anemia going, they're useful. But for the most part, they're not the be-all. They're not sports medicine tests. For example, just a PCV count can really throw you off. There's so many people out there pumping vitamin B and iron into their horses because somebody has told them that they've got an anemic horse, when really what they've got is a fit horse with a higher and higher percentage of his red blood cells being sequestered away in the spleen, so that given a given piece of adrenaline producing work, those cells can be injected into the bloodstream. So if you get a full all-out let's go kind of a blood count is 66% PCV, but you won't see that. Typically you'll see 40, 42, but in a real fit horse you're going to be seeing the low 30s, 31, 32, 33, because more and more of those red blood cells, because the capacity of the spleen to store backup troops is being increased by the level of fitness of the horse, more and more of those red blood cells, a higher and higher percentage, are being stored away. So if you want to get an accurate picture of whether or not your horse has anemia, you're going to have to do it some other way than PCV count. That's too simple and inaccurate a way to determine that. Nevertheless, there are 10,000 vets out there that will be doing just PCV tests and coming to the conclusion that your horse needs all sorts of vitamin B shots. Too bad, but that's the way it is. You can tell during an exercise, one of the things that will happen is if the exercise is too strenuous, or if you do too many strenuous exercises in a row, you're going to get a situation where the muscle cells don't recover in time or are damaged by overwork in a given workout. And when that happens, they spill, they break, they pop apart and spill their enzymes into the bloodstream. And these enzymes then, the quantity of those enzymes in the bloodstream, tell you how much muscle damage you have. For example, in a situation where a horse is tying up, you see a dramatic increase in SGOT, CPK, LDH. You'll see those enzymes scream to the top of their limits. And then you'll see, as the repair process takes place, you'll see them go back down into the normal ranges again. Well, in a given piece of exercise that, let's say, is done without enough supporting nutrition, so that the horses are underfueled and exhaust quickly, and then cannibalize each other for fuel as the horse is still going on and performing exercise, you'll see these same enzymes released into the bloodstream. You'll see muscle myoglobin released into the bloodstream. If this goes on long enough, and it's a chronic progressive fatigue situation in the muscles, then you'll see the monocyte count going up, because of a generalized monocytes happen when there's a widespread generalized inflammation of muscle tissue. And you'll see those monocyte counts going from under 5% to as high as 15%. And generally, when you see that rise in monocyte counts, it means you stop everything for 2 weeks and allow those muscle tissues to come back together before you go on, because and then you figure out why this is happening. Are you doing too much work, too high speed of work too soon? What is the problem? Are you feeding enough carbohydrate and protein, allowing those muscle cells to refuel and rebuild themselves? If not, you've got to correct the situation. You're doing something wrong. Early warning system says stop and fix what you're doing. You can look at a chemical called GGT, which is an indicator that activity is an indicator of stress, and the higher it goes, the more of a problem the horse is going to have in the conditioning process. In fact, there's good science out there on that particular enzyme to track a horse through a total conditioning program and keep him in the range of viability from workout to workout, so that he doesn't get overstressed and he's not understressed, that he's in the target range for developing a good racehorse. This information has been done in England. T3s and T4s, thyroid activity. A lot of fillies, a lot of horses in general have underactive thyroids, and they get tired and washed out and progressively fatigued. And it has nothing to do with feeding or anything else. It has to do with thyroid activity, and they need thyroxine as a supplement. But you can't decide that until you look at the thyroid activities, T3 and T4 test. It should be a part of your blood test. There are dozens of other blood tests that can help you estimate how well your horse is progressing through a conditioning program, how much damage the conditioning program is doing to him, how quickly he's recovering from each workout that you're doing, so that you can schedule workouts at 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, find out what his conditioning curve is, find out when he reaches his peak of supercompensation, so there's time to hit him with a piece of work and you don't miss it, so his readiness dribbles back down to nothing again. These are important things to know, and a good blood testing program can help you determine that. Also, when something goes wrong that you don't know what it is, blood tests are an ideal diagnostic tool. You've got to have blood testing, some kind of sophisticated blood testing, in a good sports medicine facility. Let's talk about rehabilitation. Some injuries can be rehabilitated, some cannot be. The injuries that cannot be are severe degenerative joint disease, severe bowed tendons, tendon tears, ligament tears. Rehabilitation can take place in less severe bone problems, less severe tendon ligament problems. Preventive, we talk about bleeding, and we know that bleeding can, through our experience, we can tell you that bleeding can essentially be prevented through a good comprehensive cardiovascular program before you go into high-speed exercise. There's a significant lessening of blood pressure and blown out capillaries in the lungs if you can build a good capillary system throughout the muscles and throughout the heart-lung interface. And it just spreads the pressure and relieves these kind of things. But once a horse bleeds, you've got a big problem because scar tissue forms in the lungs, and that scar tissue is not as flexible and as elastic as the original tissue, and consequently it tears, and it tears the tissue around it when it again comes into stress. When you think of what a horse does, especially a galloping horse does to breathe, we know that thoroughbreds breathe with every stride, and the reason they breathe with every stride is that when the legs go out, they have room to take a breath. When the legs come together, the whole gut, the whole mass of gut, and I don't know how many, couple hundred pounds of gut slams against the diaphragm and makes them breathe out the air. Okay, so a great deal of pressure on the diaphragm and on the lung tissue with every stride of the horse. That's why you can only breathe once every stride. So you want to make that cardiovascular system very strong and elastic and avoid injuring it. But let's talk about rehabilitation now. Rehabilitation comes in many appropriate and many inappropriate forms in the horse racing industry. We've talked in other tapes about aquatic treadmills as being an inappropriate rehabilitation technique. When you think of rehabilitation and you think of human athletes, one of the things that happens when an athlete tears a knee ligament, the therapy for that, the exercise therapy that is eventually applied when the joint is stabilized, either through taping or through bandaging or through surgery. Once it's stabilized, then exercise at that specific point is what heals and strengthens beyond re-injury that tendon or ligament. The idea then that you take a horse and buoy him up in water and then exercise him through water resistance to heal, let's say, a knee, that's not appropriate therapy. But besides that, you do get a cardiovascular effect if you spin that thing up and get good heavy water in there. You get some cardiovascular effect in that the heart rate is pushed to 190, 195, somewhere in there. You get a cardiovascular effect, but you get inappropriate muscle training. The horse's legs are pushed backwards by the treadmill, and he works his legs forward through resistance. So the muscular exercise that the horse is getting is with the antagonist muscles to his forward propulsion. And he overdevelops the antagonist. Then when you take him back out on the racetrack, and typically you're going to take him back out and go right back to the races with him, he's going to be there with unbalanced muscles. He's going to be there with muscles overbalanced to the antagonist, and they'll pull hard against those agonist muscles that are trying to throw the horse forward, and then you get muscle tears, tendon and ligament tears, stuff you don't want. A regular treadmill that can go at any speed you want to make it go at any grade that you want to put it at. Now that's a real good useful tool, because you can gradually increase the speeds and gradually increase, or start with a higher grade and gradually lower it so that the pressure slowly comes back to the front legs. And you can do a very scientific, accurate rehabilitation job with that type of a treadmill. Much better than you can do with any other device, including hand walking the horse. So I like those. Rehabilitation includes eliminating the cause of the problem. Shoeing and balancing are real important in this kind of thing. All these horses that supposedly have navicular disease probably can be cured with appropriate shoeing. Horses that are overstressing their tendons probably can be cured with proper shoeing. You've got to find the cause and eliminate the cause before you can rehabilitate. Rehabilitation is useless if you can't eliminate the cause. So you have to find the cause. But then rehabilitation, we've got all these little devices out there now. We've got lasers, we've got pulsating magnetic fields, we have ultrasound, we have ice, heat, TENS, electronic muscle stimulators, and we have straight exercise. Which of these are appropriate and which of these are just misspent time and money? Science says, right now, the science says that lasers and pulsating magnetic fields are probably misspent time and money. Acupuncture is probably not misspent time and money. Ultrasound and direct current stimulation on acupuncture points or ultrasound on muscles, deep heat massage with ultrasound, ultrasounding bony growths, spurs on the splints, this type of thing. These are useful techniques. Direct current stimulation of unhealed bone is certainly a viable technique for rehabilitating little old ladies who can't put their hips back together after falling down on the ice. But horses that don't knit quickly are put down anyway. So pulsating magnetic fields and direct current stimulation for bone healing is probably not an appropriate rehabilitative therapy. Exercise is one of the very best rehabilitative therapies if it's kept under control and done under a steady increasing load process, just like you would do a conditioning process, but maybe perhaps even slower than you would do a conditioning process. For example, buck shins, there's absolutely no reason to fire and blister buck shins. Buck shins can be brought back around if it's not a fracture. Now, with every buck shin that you have, you want to take an x-ray and make sure you don't have a fracture, because if you've got a fracture, it's a different ballgame. The infrared thermography can see fractures that are pretending to be buck shins. But once you know that you've got a buck shin and not a fracture, then you can figure that you're 35 days away from coming back to full exercise. Typically, it might take 40 days, might take 50 days, might take 25 days, but typically you're 35 days away from coming back to full exercise if you start with walking, and then trotting under saddle, and then cantering under saddle, and then galloping under saddle on a very gradual basis. You'll find out that the bones are not that badly stressed, and they will come back together quickly. It's not that big a deal. It's not something you want to fire and blister and turn the horse out for 3 months, because then you'll come back. The typical thing is to come back and do the same damn thing that caused it in the first place, and you're back out there with buck shins or a fracture or bad ankles or some other pathology from the original cause. Too fast, too soon is buck shins. And horses that are doing 6 miles to 8 miles a day can be bucked just as easily as can horses that are doing a mile a day, if you drop from a 3-minute rate to a 2-minute rate overnight, or 2:30 rate to a 1:40 rate overnight. If you do that and breeze that horse 3/8, you're going to set yourself up for buck shins. That's how buck shins happen. Too fast, too soon. Too big a surprise on the bones. Tendons need to be rehabilitated through exercise. Tendons and ligaments both. And the reason is because the other ways to go about it is to inject them with corticosteroids. When you do that, it sucks the swelling down, sure enough, but causes some of those tendon cells to turn to bone and make that tendon stiffer and make it then pull away from the sesamoids or cause other problems within itself, higher or lower than where the original problem was. That's not good therapy. It's pure stupidity practiced by a lot of racetrack veterinarians. But you don't want firing and blistering a bowed tendon or a semi-bowed tendon or a tendonitis situation. Is pure stupidity. If you do get an effect, and you probably don't unless you really push that iron deeply into the tissue, the effect will be scarring and cross-hatched, mismatched scarring. What you want is that new collagen to come in, laid down in the line of stress, and the only way to get that done is to exercise, to flex that tendon lightly at first, then harder and harder, causing that collagen to come in lined to the stress of flexion. You don't want it to come in all crosshatched like a patch of chewing gum stuck on the tear, because it's weak and it'll tear again just at the same place. So instead of 3 months of rest and all this kind of garbage, what you need is a gradual reintroduction to exercise as soon as the tendon swelling and edema is brought under control. How do you bring it under control? Ice. For just about every soft tissue injury, ice is the first thing you go to, because you want to control the swelling. You want to keep the swelling from causing more tissue damage at the site of the injury. The horse has an immune system that is real responsive to any injuries. It wants to immobilize the animal until the problem is corrected, because he's got 1,000 pounds or 20,000 pounds on a given stride on that leg coming down on it, and it'll just rip that tendon in half if he keeps on doing it. So what nature has done is said, I'm going to shut this horse down. And when I shut this horse down is to blow up that whole area. And if I cause tissue damage, hey, tough. I'm saving his life. I'm going to cause him to be completely immobilized in that leg until it's healed. Well, again, we can't wait that long. We can get the job done sooner if we control that absolute swelling right in the beginning with the application of cold. And cold has to be applied carefully. First of all, the most effective cold is ice water, as opposed to cold wraps or lotions that are supposed to be cold, or alcohol rubs, or hosing, and this kind of thing. Ice water, and the best way I've shown on another videotape, the interval training, the Thoroughbred videotape, wrapping polo bandages around the leg after having soaked them in alcohol, water, and ice mixture, third. This, and then pouring that mixture down through those polo bandages, 2 polo bandages per leg up past the knee, and then pouring the water over that for about a 20-minute period will really get the leg cold and suck in those blood vessels and make them produce less swelling. You've got to be careful with it, though. About 20 minutes is enough. You go to a half hour, 40 minutes of it, and you'll get the reverse reaction. You'll get the tissues saying to the rest of the body, hey, we're freezing, we're going to get frostbitten, the tissue's going to die down here if we don't have a blood supply, and all of a sudden the autonomic nervous system opens the floodgates and you get a big swelling reaction again. So 20 minutes of good steady ice is great, and you can do that 3 or 4 times a day, but never more than about 20 minutes at a time, because you get the adverse reaction, the reopening of all the blood cells down there. So ice is your first part of rehabilitation. It starts immediately when you see the problem. Generally, when you see a tendon or a soft tissue problem, if you see it the day it happens, you got a real big long-term problem. If you see it 3 or 4 days later, which is more common, you've got a less of a problem, but you've got to take care of it. You've got to go after it and cure it and make sure that it's not going to recur, because when it does recur, it'll recur the day you did it, and then you've got a big problem. So if you see swelling today on a tendon, and you didn't do anything today to hurt the tendon, and you decide that, well, the horse must have done it in the stall, he must have come up and clipped himself, and it's just a wrap and not a problem, believe me, think back 3 days and think back what you were doing then, because that's what caused this particular problem. They just don't bump up their tendons in the stall very often, unless they got their legs over the screen in front or something like that. They just don't do it to themselves in the stall. A lot of trainers think that they do, but they don't. It's what you did 3 or 4 days ago that's causing this problem right now. There is good therapy for joint problems. Generally in joint problems, again, it's that synovial membrane that gets inflamed and causes the chemicals within that joint to go bad, and they cause then cartilage wear. 2 miracle drugs are out. One is hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid helps balance the fluid inside the joint and de-inflame the synovial membrane, bring it back into balance. Equine is another drug that is good as a prophylactic drug, as a preventative drug. Equine tends to make cartilage nourish itself and thicken and become stronger, repair itself more quickly. And Equine, this is IM, this is not into the joint. Hyaluronic acid is into the joint, and typically after a hyaluronic acid injection you get a swelling reaction, an inflammation reaction, and that's too bad. But hyaluronic acid is a good, useful drug, especially if you use it as a part of a rehabilitation process and not as a way to get the horse to race back on Friday afternoon. That kind of a quick fix can be done, but it's stupidity. For $5,000 on a weekend race, the long-term viability of a horse is more important. Now, typically by the time a typical trainer gets around to using hyaluronic acid, the horse is all gone anyway. So I guess that the use of hyaluronic acid to race on Friday is not such a bad idea in that case. But really, what you're trying to do is avoid quick fixes and instead catch the injuries coming on earlier and adapt your systems to the horse rather than trying to squeeze the horse's body through a square hole. It can't be done. Horses are not that pliable. They're not that plastic. And of course, the key sports medicine factor is exercise. And we've talked about exercise in other tapes, so I'm not going to talk about it here, but if you were going to build a sports medicine center, if you're going to spend $8 or $9 million on a sports medicine center, the primary consideration is exercise, the exercise protocol you're going to put these animals through. All else is secondary to the kind of developmental process you're putting these horses through. You can do all of the preventive maintenance and all of the sports medicine rehabilitation that you want to do, and all of the culling and everything else that you want to do, but hey, if you're not going to train the horses, if you're not going to put them through a good scientific exercise protocol, then it's all down the tubes, because you're guaranteed in 90% of the cases to just break the horses down at one point or another way early, long before they've paid you back, paid the owner back an investment. You're going to cripple the horse. So everything, all the expenditures you make on sports medicine are just stupid unless you do the exercise as well, unless the exercise is the primary goal of your sports medicine project. I've seen sports medicine places developed where the exercise was totally ignored and everything else was done pretty well. The thermography was ignored too, but there was a strong attempt to predict performance and look at injuries coming on and this kind of thing. But then if the exercise is ignored, and if you keep on going out there and breezing 33-second 3/8 once a week and doing a mile to a mile and a half a day of exercise, you're going nowhere but downhill. You can't miss but lose. You can't miss but cripple virtually every horse you put your hands on. So sports medicine is useless without the exercise portion of sports medicine. It's got to be there.